Hello there. Here we are at period 6 in our discovery of AP US history. Period 6 covers the time frames of 1865 through 1898. Those of you following along at home and doing your reading in your textbook, American Pageant textbook, this is chapters 22 through 28, so you should be reading through those. Some key concepts, some major ideas of period 6. We have the end of the Civil War in 1865, essentially traveling through to the beginning of the Spanish-American War, which takes place in 1895. We'll be looking at economic and urban development in the United States, and also at this time period, the U.S. emerges as the largest economy in the world with lots of potential international power, dabbling a little bit in imperialism, so on and so forth. So the key concepts, which are right from the AP College Board website. Number one, the rise of big business in the U.S. encouraged massive migrations and urbanization, which sparked government and popular efforts to reshape the U.S. economy and environment, and also renewed debates over national identity. The second key concept is the emergence of the industrial culture in the U.S., which led to both greater opportunities for the restrictions on immigrants, minorities, as well as women. And lastly, we view this time period as the Gilded Age. This time period witnesses new culture and intellectual movements that we had not seen before, of course, in tandem with political debates over economic and social policies. So we kind of see a second little bit of a reform movement during this time. Very interesting time period socially for the United States. So let's start with the rise of industrialization in America, and we're looking from 1865, so right here at the end of the Civil War, and traveling up through the 1900s. Just a couple major points for you here. Number one, the country was a treasure box of raw materials. We had a lot of coal, a lot of iron, a lot of ore, copper, lead, and of course oil. Number two, we had an abundant labor supply, not only from people that were here, but we supplemented that by about every year, we increased our population with hundreds of thousands of immigrants that were flowing into our country. Number three, we had growing population because things were safer, people were eating better, the economy was more stable. Our population is going to grow, and also we're going to advance our transportation. So getting from point A to B to Z was a lot easier. Capital was plentiful. This is a good time of economic growth. So we're not going to see a lot of panics worrying about having money in the bank. Number five, development of labor-saving technologies. This is industrialization in its glory days. We're going to talk about factory, the assembly line, so on and so forth. Friendly government policies. Government and big business are going to actually work together at this time period to get stuff done. And last but not least, we'll meet some talented entrepreneurs, the likes of John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, so on and so forth. So let's start with the railroads. The railroads are essentially America's first big business. They created a market for goods that was national in scale. And essentially in doing so, they encourage mass production, mass consumption, and economic specialization. So essentially you couldn't build trains without the resources that we had here in the United States, plus you needed people to build the trains, plus you needed people to build the tracks and lay the tracks and so on and so forth. So it's a huge business and a huge operation for America to undergo, and it provided lots of jobs and opportunities for people here. Resources used in railroad building promoted the growth of other industries, essentially coal and steel. Railroad time ends up becoming standard time. So instead of running across the country in different time zones and so on and so forth, the railroad helps to standardize America as well. We also see through the railroad the creation of the modern stockholder corporation, development of complex structures of finance, business management, and eventually the regulation of competition. focus a little bit on specific railways. We'll start with the Eastern Rail Lines. They had some problems with their gauges. The thing about railroads at this time is that all the different little railroad companies had their own gauges. So you couldn't take one continuous train from point A to point C because this train didn't fit on this track, which didn't fit on this track, and so on and so forth. Another baron or a big fish of the railroad industry was Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he owned New York Central Railroad, which ran from New York to Chicago. He also owned Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad. Some of these might sound familiar. I did not just pick my nose, I just scratched it. Some of these might sound familiar if you play Monopoly, of course. What he was good at, aside from this railroad business, well, what his railroads did was connected the eastern seaports to Chicago, which was a booming metropolis. So lots of shipping, importing, exporting, trading, so-and-so going back and forth. So he was essentially controlling of the eastern rail lines. Let's talk about western railroads. Having a railroad that went out west and moved around out west promoted settlement in the Great Plains. Also, this linked the west to the east and created one great national market. A lot of the companies that started their rail lines out west were lucky because a lot of the land was provided by federal grants. These provided the railroad companies with huge subsidies in the form of loans or grants. So they would be able to start this railroad with a great deal. So they didn't have to invest too much capital, and they could build their railroad, and the government actually worked with them, not against them. Eventually, we're going to see the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Union Pacific, which started from Omaha, Nebraska and headed out west, and they employed war veterans and lots of Irish immigrants. And then we see the Central Pacific Railroad, which started from Sacramento, California, and built eastward, and they hired a lot of Chinese immigrants. Essentially, the Transcontinental Railroad came together on May 10th in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah, and when the tracks met, they drove a golden stake into the ground to recognize this momentous occasion. So now, for the first time, we have a Transcontinental Railroad that actually runs from sea to shining sea. So we're connecting our East Coast and our frontier together. It's a pretty monumental situation. All right, let's talk about some industrial empires. So after the Civil War, a second industrial revolution resulted in the growth of large-scale industry and production of steel, petroleum, electric power, and the industrial machinery to produce all the goods that people were now going to consume. Let's start with the steel industry. So with the invention of the Bessemer process, which essentially was a technological breakthrough which helped to produce or create steel. This essentially launched the rise of heavy industry. So the Bessemer process, made it easier to make large quantities of steel, which essentially was more durable than iron. People were really on board with that. It was also cheaper. Andrew Carnegie gets in essentially on the bottom floor of the steel industry. He is an immigrant born in 1835 in Scotland, immigrated to America and worked his way up from poverty and essentially becomes a big wig on the Pennsylvania Railroad. He sees that the steel industry is going to boom and take off, so he starts manufacturing steel in Pittsburgh, hence the Pittsburgh Steelers. Soon, pretty much, he takes over the entire steel industry. Excuse me. By 1900, Carnegie Steel employs 20,000 people and produced more steel than any of the mills in Britain. So it really takes off. Whoops. U.S. Steel Corporation under Andrew Carnegie. He ends up selling his company in 1900 for more than $400 million to the New Steel combination group headed by J.P. Morgan, who was a banking tycoon during this time period. This was the first billion-dollar company and also one of the largest enterprises in the whole world at the time. It employed 168,000 people and also controlled 3/5 of the nation's steel business. So Andrew Carnegie did a really great job with this. Next up, the oil industry. Essentially, the oil industry is synonymous with John D. Rockefeller. He starts Standard Oil in 1863. He funded an oil company and essentially would come to control most of the nation's oil refineries by totally eliminating the competition. He also creates the Standard Oil Trust. What John D. Rockefeller does is he goes out, essentially, he creates this product, Standard Oil, creates this company, Standard Oil, and offers it to everybody at low, low prices. So essentially, he's going to put all the other small oil refineries out of work, out of business. So he goes to those refineries and just buys them and shuts them down so that he can continue to allow his business to grow. By 1881, Standard Oil controls 90% of the oil refinery business in the country. John D. Rockefeller essentially utilizes what we call a trust. A trust consisted of various companies Rockefeller had acquired and were all managed by a board of trustees. He also initiates horizontal integration of an industry. So essentially what he does is he allies with competitors to monopolize any given market. So because of John D. Rockefeller, we are going to see antitrust movement happen during this time period. Trusts come under attack because they are considered an unchecked power. As a result, Congress passes what is called the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, which prohibited any contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy of restraint or trade or commerce. Vaguely worded and not really followed by these big businessmen. It didn't really stop the development of trusts. However, the Supreme Court rules in the U.S. versus E.C. Knight Company in 1865 that the Sherman Antitrust Act could be applied only to commerce, not to manufacturing. So another win for big business. Okay, laissez-faire capitalism. So remember how I was saying that big business and politics kind of worked hand in hand, or the government worked hand in hand? Laissez-faire essentially is the idea that the government had a hands-off approach when it comes to big business. They were allowing big business to figure it out. You guys do what you need to do, we'll do what we need to do. Big business is essentially under this theory of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism took Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection and applied it to business. Essentially, only the strong would survive, and of course, the survival of the fittest. So if your business couldn't survive, obviously it didn't need to, and these other big businesses were going to come over or come in and take over. And that is the way that it should have worked, according to these guys. Of course, if you're a big business, that makes a lot of sense for you. But if you're a small business, it's not really going to help you out at all. A lot of these big businessmen also lived by the gospel of wealth, particularly Andrew Carnegie. He believed the wealthy had a God-given responsibility to carry out projects of civic philanthropy for the benefit of society. Carnegie distributed more than $350 million of his own fortune to support buildings or support the building of libraries, universities, and various public institutions. Carnegie Foundation is still in existence today, and thank goodness for Andrew Carnegie doing this, because he really helped a lot of people. I think as an immigrant coming to this country with nothing and really having to pull himself up from his bootstraps, he was very willing to give back. Okay, so I think that's where we'll stop today. Tomorrow we'll start to talk about, or for our next PowerPoint, we'll talk about innovations and technology. Have a great day. See you later, History Geeks. Bye.